Welcome back to Humanities 2. Today we're going to be looking at a period, a very interesting period known as the Scientific Revolution, from about 1543 up to 1700. The Scientific Revolution is going to have permanent implications for us today, since we live in a highly scientific and technological age. But humanity didn't always live in such an age. So we're going to look at some of the things that occurred to transform our culture into a kind of a scientific culture that we live in today. So for thousands of years, humans had used technology. The word techne is a very old Greek word, and human beings had sought technical skills and technical knowledge, but it wasn't yet quite science. And so we're going to look at what is the difference between having knowledge of how to get things done. We can see, for example, in the Roman Empire, they were able to get great things done, build colosseums and aqueducts and all kinds of fabulous structures and so forth. But that wasn't yet science. And so what we're going to do is to look at what's the difference between that and this scientific turn. So we're going to look at some key themes and figures in text in this lecture. First, we're going to look at the turn away from metaphysics to epistemology. There's a big epistemological shift that's going on here, a turn away from metaphysics to epistemology at this time period. Now, what does that exactly mean? In brief, it means that philosophers are going to begin to focus on how we know what we know, instead of focusing on what exists. Metaphysics is mostly focused on what exists and what is the nature of things, whereas epistemology will be focused on what are the tools that we use, the mental tools that we use to gain knowledge. And so epistemology is going to become front and center, and metaphysics will be kind of shoved to the back burner, and in some cases completely off of the stove. And so we now live in an age here in the 21st century where metaphysics has paled into the distance. Whereas metaphysics used to be first philosophy, epistemology in the scientific revolution will become first philosophy. Next, we're going to look at the struggle between two different schools of thought on how we should know what we know. One is empiricism, and one will be rationalism. Each of those schools is going to have a different solution to a different methodology to how to pursue knowledge. We'll look at the birth of modernity. We typically say we live in modern age, but really we live in something beyond the modern age now, a postmodern age, or even something beyond that. But at this point, right around the 16th and 17th century, we're going to see the shift to the modern period. So we're going to see the birth of modernity here. We're also going to see more things that will influence the rise of individualism in our culture. And then last, we're going to look at the specific birth of modern science in the 17th century. Some of the key figures that we'll look at today will be Copernicus, Tycho Brahe, Kepler, Galileo, Francis Bacon, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, René Descartes, and Newton, Isaac Newton. So that's quite a lineup of people. And all of these, in some way or another, are heavy hitters in the whole history of ideas or of science. The key text that we'll look at today will be Francis Bacon's Novum Organum and René Descartes' Discourse on Method. So let's talk a little bit more about the epistemological turn. Metaphysics is going to take a back seat, and epistemology will begin driving the world of thought. This is very intentional. Many of the thinkers, for example, Francis Bacon, René Descartes, are going to intentionally try to move beyond the world of metaphysics. They have bought into the ideas of nominalism that we saw in earlier lectures. If you remember, nominalism basically said that the metaphysical essences, the universals, are simply words. They don't really have any existence. And so what we call a universal is simply a name that we use for things. These guys have already bought into that idea, but now are going to build upon it and then ask themselves, well, if that's the case, we're really locked out of the world of knowing what really is and what the metaphysical essence of things are. Let's move on to asking the question of how do we know what we need to know. So nominalism had prepared the way for the focus on the physical world that the scientists will begin to focus on. And it will pave the way to focus on all the particular things in this world. Scholastic metaphysics, while not completely gone, grew less relevant, and it became less popular as well, and was often reviled and scorned. And we will see some of these philosophers directly attack and even ridicule scholasticism. But scholasticism still had a presence in the culture due to the Counter-Reformation. The Counter-Reformation of the Roman Catholic Church, perhaps most notably or most crystallized in the Council of Trent from 1545, and going on for some 18 years after that point. That council basically enshrined Thomistic theology and Thomistic philosophy and made it into the permanent teaching and embodiment of the Christian teaching of the church. And so there will be scholastics after this point. But nevertheless, the rest of the world is going to continue to move on away from scholasticism. And we'll see this especially with René Descartes. He was trained by Jesuit priests who were deeply scholastic in their thought. But he is going to move beyond that and to try to turn a corner and leave it behind. Now, what is epistemology? I know it's a big word. It means it's the area of philosophy that explores the proper basis of knowledge. How can we attain it, and why can we know anything at all? And so modern epistemologists try to avoid skepticism by finding a solid basis for gaining knowledge. Now, we're going to see that skepticism is going to be a huge problem at this time point in history as well, because all kinds of things are going on to kind of like turn the world of accepted wisdom completely upside down. But the two schools that will emerge will be the empiricists and the rationalists. Briefly, the empiricists, and anytime you hear the word empiricism or empirical, it means that they're seeking knowledge through the senses, through the five senses. And so all knowledge on the empirical view of epistemology has to come through the senses. That's the starting point of all knowledge. The rationalists, on the other hand, do not believe this. They believe that the starting point for knowledge is going to be something that is buried within the powers of rationality. And you don't get that through the senses, okay? So the key to unlocking knowledge will be rational powers. Now, it doesn't mean that a rationalist can't use or appeal to the senses. It just means that the starting point for knowledge is reason. Same thing on the other side of the empiricists. The empiricists will obviously think about what streams in through their senses, but the starting point for knowledge is the senses. So empiricists seek knowledge through experience and observation. It's often called a posteriori knowledge. A posteriori means after experience or based on experience. So you'll hear the word a posteriori and a priori. These are two epistemological terms. If something is a priori, it's prior to experience, prior to sensation. I can know that 2 + 2 = 4, for example, prior to any experience, prior to looking at 2 objects added to 2 other objects and the result being 4 objects. I don't need to do that. Before any experience, I can already know the answer to that question. And so, but a posteriori knowledge, you must have experience. If you say, I have an apple, well, I'm not going to know whether it's a red or a green apple until you show it to me. And I have to see it, okay? So my knowledge of what color the apple is going to be based on experience. It's an a posteriori form of knowledge. Now, the empiricists also, and we'll see this especially with Locke, the empiricists believe in a theory called the Tabula Rasa theory of the mind. The idea here is that your mind is a blank slate or a blank sheet of paper, and there's nothing written on that sheet of paper when you were born. All knowledge that you have in your mind comes through the experiences that write those experiences on the blank sheet of your mind. So when you're born, you're basically just, your mind is a blank. And as you grow up as a child, you have obviously an enormous stream of sensations that flow in. And as you mature as an adult, and eventually you build up a huge body of knowledge. Now, empiricism is not completely new in this time period either. Truth be known, if we follow empiricism back to its most ancient sources, it will go through Aristotle and even to the atomists, who will argue that knowledge has to start with the senses, and they will focus on this world and on what you can sense in this world. And the same thing with the rationalists. If we followed the rationalists back, we would find that they too track back to an ancient source, namely Plato and the Pythagoreans, who so greatly treasured rational knowledge, the kind of knowledge that can come only through grasping principles, rational principles that you don't actually see in the physical world anywhere.